Okay, in just under 30 seconds, we're about to start. All right, we are starting, and for the record, this discussion is on the record. It's being recorded for our own internal purposes. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. We are delighted that you're able to join us. This evening, we'll have a very intense discussion from very seminal speakers, talk about democracy in the digital age. So thank you very much for joining us. For the purposes of this discussion, just a few ground rules before I introduce the speakers. Everybody else who is joining us has been muted so that we are able to hear each other clearly. If you would like to speak later on, you're going to have to go to the participant tab and raise your hand. Once you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and allow you to ask your questions. Secondly, we would encourage everybody to try and mute their microphones if not unmuted yet, and so that we can hear each other and avoid background noise. We will also ask for those who have unstable networks to use audio, because it tends to be smoother when you use audio. But that said, again, thank you very much. I assume that in this COVID period, all of us are familiar now with online meetings and discussions of this nature and are familiar with the technology. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. So first, let me introduce the panelists. The panelists will be speaking, each one of them, for about 5 to 7 minutes. I will then engage them into a Q&A and take questions from the participants on the webinar. So panelists are, let me start by introducing Francis Fukuyama. Francis, in fact, needs no introduction. Many people actually know you from the feedback that we have been receiving. A lot of people know you in Uganda. I was a bit surprised by that. But Francis is the Oliver Nomeli Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, the FSI at Stanford University. He's also the director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy at Stanford, and the Most Bachelor Director at the FSI's Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's also a professor by courtesy in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. There are many other things I can say about him, but I think those will be sufficient for the purpose of this discussion this evening. But his research area include developing nations, governance, international political economy, nation building, democratization, strategic and security issues. Francis is a renowned seminal author who has written so many books. I've really seen people asking questions about your book on the end of history. We can get to that later. But his latest book is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and Politics of Resentment. So thank you very much, Francis, for joining us. Our second panelist is Larry Diamond. Larry is also a Stanford fellow. Larry is the senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. For more than 6 years, Larry directed the FSI's Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, where he now leads its program on Arab reform and democracy and its global digital policy incubator. Larry is the founding co-editor of the Journal for Democracy and also serves as a senior consultant at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, DC. Larry's research area focuses on democratic trends and conditions around the world and the policies of reform to defend and advance democracy. Larry's latest book, Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, is a good read if you haven't read it. And if I may say, Larry, here, that the book is dedicated to many people, but partly to myself, for which I am deeply grateful. Larry is also serving on the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy, where I also sit as a member of the steering committee. Thank you so much, Larry, for joining us. Last and by no means least is our speaker, Perry Aritua from Uganda. Perry is a Ugandan trained lawyer, currently serving as the executive director of the Women's Democracy Network, the largest democracy network for women, working on various issues, but more particularly on the role of women in elections. Perry is also a member of the World Movement for Democracy Forum, a global network for civil society activists, scholars, thought leaders, journalists, and funders who are committed to advancing the world democratic order. So thank you very much, each one of you, for joining us.
Thank you.
For the start, we've asked Perry to provide a 5 to 7 minute discussion on the Ugandan context. As many of you know, Uganda will be going into a general election in February of next year. In the run-up to the elections, there have been many discussions around how the elections should be conducted in the context of the COVID pandemic. So I'll invite my sister Perry to give us a quick overview of the developments in Uganda and give us a context for this discussion. So over to you, Madam Perry.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. I'll go dive straight in. Article 61 of the Constitution of Uganda spells out the functions of the Electoral Commission. Among others, the Electoral Commission is responsible for organizing our elections, and the section is quite clear in terms of what the Electoral Commission should do. One of its roles to ensure that the elections that are organized are regular, free, and fair. And they're also responsible for supervising different referenda in this country. And the Electoral Commission also is responsible for hearing complaints during elections. And it also implements civic education programs relating to elections. And then, of course, Article 61B also, Article 62 of the Constitution also says that the Electoral Commission shall be independent. That means it is supposed to play its role independent from direction of any authority in Uganda. Now, on June 16th, the Electoral Commission released a revised roadmap. Because, of course, bearing in mind that we are going through a pandemic, COVID-19, it revised its roadmap, and among the new proposals was that all election campaigns would be held via media. Now, it's important to provide the context of the media in this country and the context of the citizens in this country so that we are able to dive into this discussion. One is the Electoral Commission cannot issue new rules unless if Parliament amends at sections 24 of the Presidential Elections Act and section 20 of the Parliamentary Elections Act of 2005, because those campaign meetings and rallies, according to those two sections in the Presidential Elections Act and the Parliamentary Elections Act, are supposed to be campaign meetings and rallies. Right now, that is the law. So we have not yet got an amended law which says that campaign meetings and rallies should be abolished and that all campaigns should be held exclusively via media. Secondly, the context of elections in the past has shown that state-owned media has been biased, especially towards the incumbent. In 2016, the African Center for Media Excellence observed the media coverage of the elections. And from their findings, 67.5% of all the coverage on the state-owned media, particularly Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, was given to the incumbent. The next candidate just behind the incumbent got only 11.3%. In addition, radio, which is the most listened to medium of communication in this country, is not resident in all the districts in this country. Now, what the new proposal means that if you are in a district which does not have a radio station, you may not then be able to conduct your campaign, you know. And then secondly, we have about 135 districts, and the entire country has around 309 radio stations. So radio is the most listened to means of communication, but the number of candidates who stand in each election keeps increasing. I'll just give you an example. In 2016, the number of candidates who contested for member of parliament on the open seat, which is the seat where both women and men can stand, was 1,343. This was only for the constituency seat. When it came to the local council seats, they're in thousands. So to even access media only in the coming elections would almost be next to impossible if the proposal by the Electoral Commission stands. Then the second most means of communication in Uganda, according to the Uganda National Housing Census report of 2014, is actually word of mouth. And by the time the census was done, 19.6% of the population actually got information through word of mouth. Now, when it comes to social media, a research was done by an organization called CIPESA, and they released findings on the National Technology Survey 2016-2017. The research showed that only 16% of Ugandans who owned a mobile phone had a smartphone. Now, if we are talking about social media, how many Ugandans can be able to access information via social media? In addition to that, about 2 years ago, government introduced a social media tax. So apart from paying for data to access social media, you also have to pay what we call OTT, you know, so that you're able to access social media. In addition, when it came to coverage of the last election campaigns, most of the stories were single-sourced stories, according to the African Center for Media Excellence. In addition, only 14% of those stories were responsive to women. That means only 14% of those stories where women were the source of those stories. So that even tells you that if we are to have media exclusive campaigns, the number of women who will have access to media may even be less than what we had in 2016. And then just I think just before polling, social media was switched off by the Uganda Communications Commission. So if we are to even use only social media, we already have precedent that social media can be switched off. Now, if most of the information from candidates and even voter education is supposed to be conducted via social media and radio and TV, then you will have a large section of the population not having access to media. The other is media in this country is quite expensive. A radio talk show, a 1-hour radio talk show on most of the stations outside Kampala costs between, it's about 700,000 shillings to about 2 million shillings. In dollars, that would be about maybe between $200 to maybe about $500 or $600. That amount of money is not affordable by most people in this country. And then the World Bank just this week released their report, and they said that about 3 million Ugandans are going to slide back into poverty. By 2016-2017, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, through their Uganda National Household Survey, had indicated that about 10.1 million Ugandans were living below the poverty line. So how will people then, you know, when it comes to your choice, of course, you choose food to either buying airtime or data to listen to a candidate or to even respond to any message. So when it comes to voter education, that means a number of Ugandans will not be able to listen to voter education messages. Lastly, we have had incidents in the past where members of the opposition, especially their leaders and their candidates, have been pulled out of radio stations, you know, by security agents, by resident district commissioners. So you have a number of people who will not be able to access these stations if we go by the trends in 2016 and immediately after 2016. So that would mean that some of the candidates, particularly in the opposition, would then not have an opportunity to communicate their messages to the population. So for me, what is the implication? That for elections to be free and fair, access to media must be for all candidates. But secondly, if the rules of an election are already unfair, then the results cannot be fair. So that is why the context right now shows that if we are to only have exclusive media campaigns, we'll have a big section of our population disenfranchised due to cost and affordability. Due to cost and lack of access. We will also have a number of candidates not being able to access media, particularly women and the youth, because of the cost, but also because of the media bias toward those two interest groups when it comes to them being as sources of stories and information during campaigns. So that's really a brief context of media in this country and the context of a population which is being told that you will only be able to access information via media and that the candidates will only be able to campaign using media. It will disenfranchise a number of Ugandans.
Okay, thank you very much, Perry. Just to add a little bit of what you've said, all of this is being done because of the COVID situation in Uganda.
Yeah,
the explanation given by the state is that it is impossible to conduct elections in the way that we know it, namely to hold large rallies, to encourage large gatherings, and therefore to ameliorate a possible catastrophe. The state is suggesting that candidates should devise other means of accessing the population and campaigning. They've suggested the use of digital platforms, social media, internet, and other such platforms. They've suggested the use of radios as a means of accessing the population. Of course, this happens in the broader concerns about the democratic trajectory in Uganda. Many indices, including Freedom House, rate Uganda as as undemocratic, really, authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. And there's real concern whether we have used the pandemic really to entrench authoritarian leadership in Uganda. And given that context, Francis Fukuyama, you are a seminal scholar, you studied democracies across the world. What is your general sense of whether we can hold elections in the pandemic era, really? And if we are able to do so, what must we look out for? What are the concerns around not just the pandemic, but the digital impact, the use of technology in elections? Over to you, Francis.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak on this panel. And Perry, thank you very much for that briefing. I must say that I don't know that much about Uganda, so it's very useful to have this kind of detailed information about exactly the kinds of abuses that I think are likely to be committed as you go into this election. And I think it adds to a general worry that I know Larry Diamond has been speaking and writing about quite extensively about what the COVID epidemic is going to do to democracy generally. So just to state some obvious things, in a national emergency like a pandemic, every country in the world will expand executive powers. It's inevitable that this happen because public health takes priority over other kinds of concerns. And holding elections is one aspect of many other dimensions of state power that are affected by this increase in executive powers. And so what we've seen in many countries around the world is for authoritarian governments or politicians in democratic states that have authoritarian leanings to take this as an opportunity to expand their powers. And so there's a lot of cases where this has been going on, in Europe, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, got his parliament. He has a majority of seats in the Hungarian parliament, and so early on they voted him emergency powers to pretty much rule by decree. One of the first things he did was to ban LGBT rights, as if that was the most pressing thing going on in Hungary at that moment. But it's an example of the kind of abuse. In El Salvador, President Bukele has basically been ruling by decree in a similar sort of way, bringing the military back into politics, using uniformed officers to intimidate members of the parliament. And then you have overtly authoritarian countries like China, which I think have felt free to pursue things that they wanted to do in any event, like reassert control over Hong Kong. And I think they felt that they could do this because of the international preoccupation that every country in the world is really worried about itself above anything else at the moment. And in particular, the United States, which even before the epidemic was not fulfilling its usual role as a monitor of global democracy, is even less inclined to do that. And so I think that China felt it could get away with this reassertion of control over Hong Kong because of that distraction. So this is a general worry. I think that elections in particular are extremely problematic. Now, it is possible to hold a free and fair election under circumstances of a pandemic. South Korea held a national election a couple of months ago, and no one contested. In fact, the ruling party did well, or the party that's been controlling the parliament in recent years did well, but I think that was a genuine expression of democratic approval for a government that had actually handled the pandemic well, and I think really reflected the will of the people. But there's plenty of other cases where that is less likely. I mean, another example of that was Serbia, which held a national election, I believe about 10 days ago, in which the President Vučić, his party managed to get a large majority because all of the other parties felt that he had stacked the electoral rules to such an extent that they couldn't really fairly participate. And so most of the opposition parties actually boycotted the election. And so he now is in control. I think that the digital dimension, again, this is something that Larry can speak much more to, adds a special degree of inequality, because as Perry was indicating, in many countries, especially in poor countries, access to the internet is not universal. It's something that tends to be held by people that live in big cities, that are better educated, that have more income, can afford smartphones, have better internet connectivity. And so obviously if you limit campaigning to the internet or to online sources, it's really not going to reach a large part of the population. And by the way, this is an issue that affects the United States as well. I mean, one of the things we've discovered is that, Stanford and every other university, but also every other school in the United States moved to an online format this spring as the epidemic struck. And one thing that we've realized is that there are many people in the United States that don't have internet access, or where maybe there's one computer in the family, and a student needs it for several hours a day, but so do the parents, so do the brothers and sisters, and that's really been a problem. It's also reinforced, I think, the narrow channels. I don't know whether you have Facebook Basics in Uganda, but Facebook has been making this big effort to really dominate online markets in developing countries, where it's crowded out virtually every other way of accessing the internet. And so in the Philippines, for example, very few people were online, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Facebook basics entered the country. It's a very simplified system that people can get without a smartphone. I mean, they can just have an old, a much older type of phone, get on the internet and get a kind of simplified access to information. But it's controlled by, it's easily dominated by President Duterte, who's used that to really crowd out other sources of information. And finally, I would go back to the United States and say, it's not clear, and I'm sure Larry wants to speak much more about this, but it's not clear that the United States is going to be able to hold a free and fair election in November for a whole variety of reasons, that many states really don't want to let everybody vote, and they're not making it easy to use mail-in ballots or alternative ways of voting. So I would say, and this is something that really makes me very sad, I wouldn't have thought that the United States would be setting a bad example in an area like holding an election under epidemics, under crisis conditions, but we actually may not be able to do this so well. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Francis. If I may stay with you a little bit and ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned that it is possible to hold a free and fair election in the circumstances that we are in. What are the things that we need to have in place to ensure that that happens, given the public health concern which you have articulated? What should we do as a country? What needs to be put in place to ensure that that happens without risking public health?
Well, I think they're pretty straightforward. You need alternative ways of casting ballots other than going to polling places. And if you do have open polling places, they need to practice social distancing. The poll workers in particular need to be protected. All of the monitors and so forth that are there to guarantee free and fair elections need to be protected. And all of that costs money. And so one of the things that I think we're seeing is that by denying adequate resources to election officials, you can effectively control access to the vote. And like I said, unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing in the United States, where the Republicans have not been willing to vote extra money to states and localities who are the ones ultimately in our country responsible for overseeing an election. In a country like Uganda, where there's much less online access, I suspect problems support election officials. But, I think what in theory needs to be done is pretty straightforward.
Okay, great. You mentioned South Korea having held elections. There are also examples of African countries that have held elections in these circumstances. Burundi, Malawi, I think there are local government elections in Ghana. They have held these elections. What are the things, if you have paid attention to those elections, that Uganda can learn from, especially on the public health end, as well as the use of technology?
I'm going to have to defer maybe to Larry on that, because I don't follow those situations closely enough to really give you an intelligent answer.
Fair enough, fair enough. Thank you very much, Francis. Let me turn this over then to Larry. Of course, your colleague Francis has passed on the responsibility to you. You follow African politics. You know a lot about East Africa, about Uganda. You've also written extensively about the impact of the pandemic on the liberal democratic order. If you could please, in 5-7 minutes, what are your key concerns and what are the things that we need to be looking out for in this context?
Well, my biggest concern is the lack of the most basic conditions for a free and fair election, in terms of the independence of the Electoral Commission, the independence of the police, the independence of the state, and the restraint of the state from being the repressive authoritarian actor that it has been for the 35 years that Yoweri Museveni has been president of the country. I think we have to begin by noting how grotesque it is that someone who came to power in 1986 is presumably going to be running for yet another term as president of the country. So he can remain among the rogues gallery of rulers, including Teodoro Obiang, Paul Biya, Ayatollah Khomeini, Hun Sen, and others who've been in power well over 30 years. You know, if Uganda had ever been anything close to a democracy, we would be ending the second term of Dr. Besigye as president of Uganda and transitioning probably to a third president for this era. So we begin with these facts. Uganda is an authoritarian regime that has become, over the years of Museveni's rule, more deeply and brutally authoritarian. It's got some aspects of competitive authoritarianism, and the opposition needs to continue to use those in order to try to produce the surprise victory that some oppositions have been able to produce in other competitive authoritarian circumstances, like the ones in Georgia, Serbia, and Ukraine that led to democratic transitions in each of those countries. Before I get, Nicholas, to the specific conditions for electoral and campaign regulation and administration, let me say that the opposition must learn from the examples of previous instances, including Malaysia as well, where democratic oppositions faced with a competitive authoritarian regime managed to pull off a miracle victory. And the single most important one, with Malaysia being the most dramatic example of this very recently, is they've got to combine forces. And the news that Bobby Wine and Dr. Besigye have in principle done so is, I think, extremely important. But you can't field more than one major opposition candidate against the ruler and expect to win in the face of all of these massive, undemocratic institutional disadvantages. The second point is, I think if you look at most African countries, and if you look certainly at Uganda, which is typical of most African countries, most African voters are going to get their news and information from radio if they can't do it by face-to-face methods. And there have been some innovations in extending the reach of low wattage FM radio stations and using modern technology to create transmission capacities for low wattage FM radio stations. And this has, I think, great potential to reach the rural areas. And I think certainly the government is going to have no interest in promoting this for obvious reasons. So I think that civil society needs to come forward as an alternative actor in pursuit of free and fair elections on a nonpartisan basis, and approach international donors and see what you can put in place to expand the radio broadcasting capacity in rural areas, and to take on the role of independent, neutral, nonpartisan radio broadcasting through some of these new technologies for the pure purpose of enabling all candidates from the ruling party, from opposition parties, independents, and so on, but most important, the major presidential candidates, to get their news and get their campaign platforms out to the rural areas, and also to come back to some of the issues Frank was raising, to educate voters on how they will vote in a pandemic. This is going to be very important. I don't think there's going to be mail-in balloting in Uganda to any significant degree, like we will have in at least some states in the United States. So people are going to have to come to the polls. They're going to have to practice social distancing. They're going to have to wear masks or some kind of face covering. This takes a period of education in order to make people aware of this and how to exercise their democratic rights in a pandemic. And of course, in an authoritarian regime like Museveni's, benefits from confusion, disarray, and demobilization. I don't know that they're going to be very energetic in conveying this information in a neutral and effective way. So once again, civil society must come forward in order to do this. You got about 6 months to put this together. And by whatever means necessary, you need to convey to people the importance of voting, the means of voting, the requirements for voting safely in a pandemic. And finally, you need the international community to take this seriously and to prevail upon the election commission in Uganda and the government of Uganda to make good faith efforts to conduct this election in a serious, inclusive, fair, and neutral fashion, and to make clear to the Ugandan government that it will be held accountable by the democracies of Europe, the United States, Canada, and so on, for deliberate efforts to obstruct the minimum conditions for a free and fair election.
Okay, great, Larry, but if I may just stay with you and say this, that the European Union that has for a very long time been sending election observation missions to Uganda has this time declared that they would not be able to do so. So you see, either because of the pandemic or because of grave concerns about the uptake of their recommendations in the past elections. So we see a retreat from the European Union. And of course, many people now look to the United States and don't see an inspiration. We've for a long time looked up to the US as a moral global leader and now we are seeing a retreat. As we speak now, there's no US ambassador to Uganda. I wonder whether you have any recommendations for the international community, in this case, the European Union, but also additionally, if you could speak to the role of technology, because technology can also be an inhibiting factor as well in the election. And yet we are being told now we must use digital means for campaigns and outreach. While it can be incredibly useful, it can also be a source of danger. If you could speak a bit about what those dangers might be and what we need to look out for, would appreciate.
Well, first, I want to say that American foreign policy is going to change, I think, pretty dramatically on January 20th of next year, when I think, in all likelihood, Joseph Biden becomes president of the United States. Biden has made clear that democracy will be a major theme, democracy and human rights, of foreign policy in a Biden administration. And I think that the kinds of shenanigans that Museveni and his regime have been engaging in all over again for yet another electoral cycle under a new administration. And I think that the Museveni administration will need to take this into account, certainly if Biden is elected on November 3rd. With respect to technology, Nicholas, you use whatever you have. Obviously, you use smartphones. Even simplified mobile phones can receive text messages. So, you know, might that be a possibility for some simple text messaging? I continue to believe what I said, that you should really explore how to proliferate broadcasting from low wattage community FM radio stations, and to put this equipment in place in rural areas and create networks of these stations that can communicate with one another and broadcast common messages, as well as localized messages for localized races. Of course, in an authoritarian regime, we're seeing this in Ethiopia now, the authoritarian regime, if it comes under pressure, can simply shut down the internet altogether.
Yeah.
And, you know, they can also flood the internet and the social media space with disinformation and fake messages. So you need to anticipate this and be prepared to counter this. Whatever you can do to construct in-person networks that where people are, you know, maybe just use telephone calls to create trees of people who will communicate with their family and friends, and, you know, designate one person to call 10 others, and then they call 10 others and convey the information that way. You have to be creative and adaptive in what you do. The final point I would make in answer to your question, Nicholas, is that in-person voting will take place. And so people should use their mobile phones to record what's happening. And if there's inappropriate activity or security forces intimidating people and so on, photographs should be taken, video should be taken. This kind of evidence can be shared with the European and other democracies, even if they don't feel able because of the conditions of pandemic, which I think are the more important motives here for opting out of election monitoring. They can take this evidence in and use it to challenge the outcome of a fraudulent election.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Larry, for answering those questions. I want to encourage people who are online attending this meeting, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We will then enable your audio and allow you to ask questions. I see Frank Rusa already online. Frank Rusa manages the Inter-Party Dialogue, which is a platform that brings together parties that are in parliament. We'd love to hear from him. He's been greatly involved in the process to push for dialogue amongst the parties and a national dialogue in the country as a whole. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. But I have two questions coming in already from our social media platforms. The first one relates to the question about postponement of the election. We have had calls for the elections to be postponed for 6 months if there's a serious public health crisis. The law in Uganda allows for that, so that we can protect the integrity of the vote. So the person who is unnamed is asking, what is, under what circumstances can we postpone the election to protect the integrity of the vote, to allow everybody to access information and be able to take part in the election? The second question is coming from Jackie Asimwe, who is online. Jackie Asime is asking about the role of civil society in election monitoring. I am sure that Perry, who is deeply involved in this process, will take this up. So if you can start with those two questions, any one of you who wants to answer, please feel free to answer. I see Frank is on. Can I ask Frank to ask his question? Frank Rusa? Go ahead, sir.
My point microphone, okay.
Can you hear us, Frank?
Hello, Larry, and yeah, nice to see Larry and Francis Fukuyama after a long time. Yeah, as Nicholas has just said, it is true that I'm currently the facilitator of high-level conversations between the presidents of the political parties in Uganda, especially those with the representation in parliament, under the umbrella of the Interparty Organization for Dialogue. This I do as the country representative for the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. And of course, as you can imagine, the biggest issue now that is of concern is how can we have credible, free and fair elections in a situation like this. Of course, there are some calls of people saying, no, we need to postpone these elections because if conditions cannot be free and fair, then there's no reason to commit so much money in a process that cannot work well, given the many institutional challenges and logistical and operational challenges that you've already pointed out. But the other voices are saying, no, we need to try and see how best we can have a quality election, even in the circumstances. Because nobody knows when COVID will be out of here. What if COVID goes on for the next 2 years? Are we going to suspend our democratic engagement in the name of COVID? So there's two tendencies on this. However, I am hearing now that the government of Uganda, and especially the president of Uganda, with the other leaders of the political parties, are showing a willingness to come to look at, to move to some central place, and that begin to talk about a hybrid. Is it possible to have a hybrid of measures to try and enhance access to citizens through various media channels, but also protect the lives of the people? So they're talking about limited campaigns, talking about maybe is it possible if we said 100 to 200 campaign agents at any time, recognizing social distance and all these other health measures, in addition to the very many other media channels. But I agree that the media penetration is not that deep, and therefore it is a problem. So I'd like to hear from Larry and Francis Fukuyama about what do you think about the voices of saying we should postpone? Does that work for pro-democracy, or it can actually be used to even undermine the aspirations of democracy even more? But that said, as I conclude, that said, the citizens of Uganda seem to be very hungry for an election, and they're saying whether it is allowed or not, there seems to be a feeling that they will definitely go out and participate with or without restrictions. So it is a very interesting situation. I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thank you for inviting me.
I mean,
thank you very much, Frank Rosa. Larry, can we take two more questions? I see Dawn, I believe that is Dawn Rukare from the Freedom House Project here in Uganda. Dawn, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good evening to the people in Uganda, and good morning to the colleagues in the States. Thank you, Nicholas, for this very interesting debate. Mine is a comment probably within that a question. I like Larry's idea, but one of the things he's asking civil society to join into probably forming these, what I'll call broad-based radio stations, or what he's calling low wattage FM radios, I think is an interesting preposition. Of course, there are issues around the licensing and whether the Uganda Communications Commission will allow that. But one of the issues that I see, having been supporting these areas for quite a while, and I would like also Nicholas's take on this, is a lot of us who are working in the development field, you'll find that a lot of the countries that Larry talked about have diplomatic relations with government of Uganda. And I always say, where does politics start and where does development stop, or the other way around? Now, one of the issues is civil society is being increasingly asked, are we doing civil society work or political activism? And very many governments, foreign governments, are very reluctant to get involved in the politics side of a lot of what we do in this democracy, rights, and governance. So my question to Larry is that line self-evident where we are doing civil society work, or it is political activism? And if we get into political activism, then do we begin being treated as political actors? And I think very many foreign governments are a bit of a problem. And I think therein, for me, is one of the issues I have with some of these. We need to probably have a platform that is more focused on how we can get the voices in Uganda to be the ones demanding, but relying on foreign capitals might be a bit of a risk, in view of what Nicholas just said. For example, the EU is not going to be very heavily involved. So that platform, to me, is something we need to interrogate further. That would be my kind of comment and question. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one question from Mr. Robert Shirunda, who is a law don at the university here. I can also say, Larry and Frank, is that Robert is an incoming Draper Hills Fellow. So Robert, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And to the panelists, Larry Diamond, Francis Fukuyama, Perry Aritua, great to see you. Mine is a broader question for Larry with regard to democracy as we know it. At the heart of democracy, I believe, is a trust, an issue, an element of trust. There seems to be a widening trust deficit growing in the world. And so the social contract as we know it, and our reliance on government of the people, for the people, by the people, seems to be under every sort of attack. In Uganda, what makes that worse is that while indeed we take all the measures that you've suggested, the Supreme Court has 3 times ruled on how technology should be used in elections, and those decisions have gone largely unheeded. How then do we prepare for what happens after the election, in which people don't trust the state to possibly organize a free and fair election, and don't trust the Supreme Court to deliver an independent verdict? Again, taking from the point that you made earlier with regard to the questions around the independence of state institutions to do their work. What do you see as the future of democracy in that context?
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right, great. I think we'll stop the questions, then allow the panelists to answer. So I don't know who wants to go first. Since many of the questions have been asked of Larry, I don't know if you want to take the first bite, Larry.
Okay, I'll just make a few brief comments because I know we don't have a lot of time. On the election postponement question, I think it's very context sensitive. And I think an election postponement can serve democracy or undermine democracy, depending on when it's done and how it's done and the context surrounding it. An election postponement in some American states for a modest period of time during the primary election season that we're now concluding, I'd say has served the democratic process by enabling these states to put in place better procedures for voting. If you have an authoritarian regime that just wants to stay indefinitely and they keep postponing elections that they think they might lose, well, obviously it's got an authoritarian implication. My point to you in Uganda would be that the decision should not be made unilaterally by the government, that it should be made in consultation with all political parties and should be a joint decision, number one. And number two, as Frank said, since we don't know when the virus is going to pass, when it will be safe to do a normal campaign and a normal election, it could be 6, 9 months, it could be 2 or 3 years. We don't know. So a postponement has to have a logic to it beyond just, we'll wait until the virus passes. And one logic would be to put in place a strategy to enable a safer election campaign, for example, through the implementation of some of the more dispersed technology of communication and broadcasting that I recommended, or through provisions for safer in-person campaigning that Frank was talking about. And maybe through the provision, there was a comment about this in the chat section, of more polling stations so people could congregate in lower densities in order to come and vote. But again, you have 6 months, so there is still time to implement a lot of these provisions. With respect to Robert's question, well, Frank has written a book about trust. I'll let him get into, let him answer it from his own perspective. But I would say, look, you have the government you have. It's not a democratic government. And so, you know, waiting 6 months or a year or asking it to behave in a way that will be more deserving of public trust in Uganda, you know, it's not a very realistic strategy. What you need to do is try and bargain with the leverage you have to get the minimum conditions for a free and fair election in this context, to ask for international support to back your negotiating positions, and to make clear to Museveni and his party that they should want to have an election where turnout is sufficient and public attitudes are sufficient, so that if he's reelected, he can have some claim to legitimacy. It isn't in his interest, really, to have a manifestly failed, low participation election.
Okay, thank you. I think we can move to Francis. I have a question that I want to add on, you can respond to as you respond to the previous ones. David Simba is asking, what can postmodern societies learn from pre-modern Greek politics as far as the practice of democracy is concerned? That's quite a loaded question. But over to you, Francis.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I have that much to add. I agree with Larry very much that you know, an issue like postponing an election really depends on the context. It could be good and it could be bad, depending. And I think it's wise to focus on procedures. I also agree with his comment about trust. I mean, yes, of course, it's good to be able to trust institutions, but oftentimes you are in a situation where the real issue is not trust, it's power. And if somebody is exercising power unjustly, you have to figure out how to restrict that power, how to gain power yourself, and then you can start worrying about rebuilding, you know, a broader social consensus revolving around trust. I'm not quite sure on that last question what's meant by kind of ancient democratic practices. You know, I tend to think that most of those precedents are not that useful in modern societies because we live in very, very different conditions where our populations are much larger, they're much more diverse, economic conditions are very, very different. And so I think the general principle that we derive, you know, that government ought to rest on the consent of the governed is probably the biggest lesson. Specific practices, I think, are things that have to evolve from, you know, the actual conditions that more modern societies find themselves in.
If I may impose on you for just a little 5 minutes, because Susan Mohereza, who works for the International Republican Institute, I think is planning to ask the two of you a question before you leave. So Susan, please, if you may, keep it precise and succinct.
Hi, Nicholas. Actually, my question is for Perry, so I can hold off.
Oh, great. So you can ask it so that Perry can then take over from there, and so that Frank and Larry can hear what Perry's responses are before they leave.
Thank you. Hi, Perry. I just wanted to go back to the point you made earlier about the inadequacies of the entire electoral process, which have been revealed by COVID and this push towards a digital electoral process. And I would like to get a sense from you of your understanding of how parties can leverage their membership, subnational structures to recruit party agents, train party agents, recruit and support candidates. What we are talking about civil society and voters, but the parties have a bigger stake in this election or the biggest stake in this election. So I wonder what you are hearing or seeing in your work with the parties. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Perry.
Yes, thank you. I'll start with the question from Jackie about the role of particularly the local CSOs in observing the election. Right now, there's a conversation in terms of putting together a structure. Of course, the discussion is how do you ensure that you're able to move away from the usual style of observing elections, because if most of the campaigns are going to go online, then you need to be able to adapt to that particular modality in terms of how you observe elections. And then, of course, there are new things that are going to emerge, the issue of cyberbullying online, the issue of body shaming, all these are new areas which civil society in the past may not have paid a lot of attention to, because most of the meetings and the campaign rallies were face-to-face. So civil society is having to learn new ways of how to observe the election, bearing in mind the context that is presented before us. But we are also advocating for small meetings for candidates, and also campaign rallies that have a minimum of between 50 and a maximum of 100. Because the reality is people will break the rules. If people cannot access media, they are going to break those rules. Right now, we know that there are candidates who are moving house to house, trying to sell their message even before the campaign period starts. We know that there are a number of candidates who are having small meetings in their homes. So if the rules are not conducive to the context, citizens and candidates will break those rules. And that's why we have been urging the Electoral Commission to have dialogue within the reality of our country, to say, can we have smaller meetings where people observe the standard operating procedures amidst COVID-19? You have smaller numbers and you regulate the process, and you also create penalties. For instance, if candidates break the rules on having smaller meetings, you can decide to ban them. That's an option, but you cannot go and dictate one method which you know is not going to work and is not working. To Susan's question about the political parties, we all know that a lot of work for political parties just happens around elections. After elections, political parties will develop strategic plans, but many of them don't implement the plans. And then secondly, there's also fear at times among the political party actors, particularly those in the opposition. Holding meetings, holding assemblies in this country is almost like a crime, even when the laws are clear about freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. So it goes back to how do we allow our rules to operate in a context that we find ourselves in. So at times they are pushed to the wall that they are not able to organize. So when you even talk about having an election using mainly the media, many of them don't have the structures to be able to do that effectively. The resources are hardly there for most of these political parties. So they find themselves in a catch-22, and that's why you hear many of them saying, let us have smaller meetings, let us have smaller campaigns where we're able to mobilize at least a few people, to be able to organize meetings at the lower levels and to be able to communicate to the population. So I really hope that the Electoral Commission heeds to our reality and allows for social distanced meetings which adhere to other operating procedures like wearing masks and things like that, so that our people are able to hear the candidates' messages and people are able to ask questions, and candidates are able to also sell their programs to the population and get elected on polling day if the population decides that that's the choice of candidate that they want. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that we can ask Larry and Frank to give us their last words before we allow them to sign on and begin their days in California. So if I can start with you, Francis, any last remarks you want to make?
No, I think that, hopefully next year will be a better year than 2020, both in terms of the progress of the pandemic, but also in terms of a kind of renewal of democracy. I think one thing that's happening, for example, is that bad governments can't hide from the virus. And if they really mess up, people are going to know it in a way that they may not know in other areas of policy. And that provides an opportunity for civil society and populations to push back against bad government. And that may happen in the United States, it may happen in Brazil, it may happen in hopefully in other countries around the world. So there's also an opportunity, I think, embedded in the current crisis.
Great. Larry, if you may.
Yeah, well, 2 points. First, specifically to Angelo Azama. Hello, Angelo. He had a question or a comment in the chat room that I think is very important, that there are, and Perry was speaking to this, people are also going to be voting for representatives, and those elections have been somewhat more competitive. So, which leads to my second point, really, my overarching point. I repeat, you use whatever space you have. You claw back whatever power you can from an authoritarian context, and you inject whatever pluralism you can into the political process. And I think there is an opportunity here, Frank is right, for people to see and evaluate the performance of government, but also we need to learn from comparative experience that you just never know when the opportunity may materialize because of a unique convergence of circumstances into a democratic breakthrough. I mean, the opposition in Malaysia tried in repeated elections over a long time, multiple decades, to try and break through. And then finally, there was a crisis of performance around corruption in Malaysia. And in a circumstance that has certain parallels to Uganda, the opposition won. So it's important to, as the American civil rights movement has as one of its phrases, keep hope alive.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Larry and Francis for joining us. I know it's early morning, you've just woken up. We'll allow you to go and start your day and come back to the rest of us who can stay on for another 10 minutes. But if you have time, stay on and hear from the rest of the guys. If you don't, we thank you profusely for finding time to share with us your insights. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Nicholas. It was good to be on.
Take care. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Larry and Frank. Appreciate it. Take care. Stay safe. I think that Dr. Don Rokare asked me a question, which I want to attempt to answer, even though I was only here as a moderator. The primary duty to ensure a democratic election in Uganda lies with people in Uganda. I don't think that we should look across the borders for any form of liberation, so to speak. That if we want to cause any meaningful change, the responsibility is going to be primarily those of Ugandan voters. But I think we should also be cognizant of the role of international actors in either entrenching or facilitating autocratic leaders across the world. There is a convergence of interest. And I think for me, in many cases, a connivance that supports autocratic leaders across the world to promote the foreign policy implications of those governments. So if those governments, foreign, are engaging our state, we have a responsibility to ask of them to engage to promote the values they so cherish and speak highly about in their countries. And so it shouldn't really concern me too much that we are asking for the European Union and other development partners to Uganda that they should invest in proper democratic processes over and above security and economic interest. By doing so, we are not displacing our responsibility as a country to foreign interests. Rather, we are saying if they are to engage in any form or shape, it must be for the promotion of mutual goals of rule of law and constitutionalism. So I hope I answered your question, Don. And that is always a pushback line used by governments to delegitimize otherwise legitimate local concerns, that you are promoting foreign interests, you are funded by foreign governments. But I think that the inherent role to push our governments lie with us. But if those governments engage with ours, we have to engage them as well and ask of them to ensure that they engage in the values that they so cherish. So I'll turn over to you, Perry, if you want to make any final remarks. I don't see any questions coming to you now. So please, Perry.
Yeah, there was just one question, I saw it on the chat about postponement. The World Health Organization has actually made it very clear. This virus is here to stay. A statement was made by, I think, a representative of theirs called Mark Ryan on 14th May. He was actually being interviewed on a BBC talk show, and he said, it's almost like HIV, you know, it's here to stay. So we must work within what we have. But the context that we have should not make our rights be infringed by those in power. And that's why I agree with you that it is citizens who must be able to demand for a free and fair election based on the context. And that's why our recommendation to the Electoral Commission has been, have dialogue with the different actors, find a middle ground that allows you to hold an election, bearing in mind the media infrastructure that we have in this country. And that's why we have recommended that, one, they could even have a meeting with private radio owners, you know, because elections are public good. Now, if the red single million, how many candidates will afford that? So they need to have a discussion, not only with the radio owners, but also with Uganda Communications Commission, because in the past, they used to be the community radios. They were banned, you know. So right now, even the recommendation Larry was giving about having these low voltage radios in rural areas may not work if we don't reach a middle ground. The other is, can we have joint campaigns if we say that radio will be the most used avenue for communication to the population, so that you do not have opposition candidates being pulled out of radio stations and being denied their right to communicate their platforms and their messages to the population. So for me, the bottom line is we need dialogue, and we need to continue pushing the Electoral Commission to reach a middle ground with all stakeholders, so that at the end of the day, our candidates are given an opportunity to be heard, voters have an opportunity to receive education through the different means that we have. Of course, not forgetting that we are in a pandemic. So the standard operating procedures should continue to guide part of this discussion. But at the end of the day, we should not infringe the rights of Ugandans to choose a candidate of their choice by using COVID as an excuse to really abuse the right to elect a candidate of one's choice. Thank you.
There's a question I'm sure you saw it from Ivan Rugambwa, that yes. For advocates of election postponement, are we sure that after 6 months the COVID situation would have subsided to allow for campaigns? If not, shouldn't both actors really in civil society and in the opposition be concerned about how we can reach a policy consensus on how to hold elections in the circumstances, rather than just being obstinately opposed to the elections for its sake? I'm sure you'll respond to him in detail further when you make your closing remarks. I see Dr. Don Rukare's hand up. So Don, please, your turn.
Thank you, Nicholas. And as I said, I thank you for this very, very stimulating debate. I totally agree with you. But I think, as I said earlier, just two things. One, you didn't get back to me on the question of where we draw the line between civil society activism and political activism, because the conversation that we have with foundations like we had today is fine. And foundations have the latitude to do very many things which bilateral organizations don't. And I hear you, and it's really my first observation and question, because this is something which increasingly is being interrogated within the development sphere, And when it comes to bilateral organizations, they are very reluctant for different reasons, political, geopolitical, to get too vested into the political arena. With a foundation like you had today here, the Hoover, those have latitude to do many things, say very many things. But when it comes to the bilaterals, it becomes a bit more complicated and more nuanced. So I think I agree with your initial response to my observation, but I can tell you that when it comes to country dynamics, it goes beyond just what the answer you gave me, but we can have a coffee over this. But where we draw the line between civil society activism, and because with foundations, they are willing to have that latitude to deal with us in that kind of wider scope. But when it's bilaterals, European Union, USID, DFID, those kind of actors have a slightly different perspective from what foundations might have and other aid or, let's say, development partners. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rukare. I will take you up on the coffee. Hopefully you can teach me a few swimming lessons as a prolific swimmer yourself. But let me say this, that I see your hand still up, or I can lower your hand for you. Let me say this, that the distinction has to be made between engagement in political activities and engagement in partisan political activity. And then many people may disagree here with me, but I think it is a legitimate right of a Ugandan civil society organization and a Ugandan involved in that. It's an inherent right for them to be concerned and engaged with the politics of the country, so that they can engage the actors. But I think that what I would be very cautious about is engagement in partisan political activity. That a civil society organization is financing a political party or is actively campaigning for a political party over another. I think that for me becomes a bit tricky. I think we should keep away from partisan politics, but that we must engage in the politics of our country. Precisely because the things we seek to address, whether it is corruption, whether it is unemployment or high mortality rate, is a result of the politics of the country. And unless you go and address these issues from the root cause, from a policy or other angles, you would only be window dressing to say, you're doing what you're doing. So I believe we must be engaged, because the root cause of our problem really is in the political decisions that the powers that be or people in office are making. And we ought to engage them constructively and in many cases to be able to hold them to account. But we are running out of time. If I may ask Perry to make any closing remarks, Madam Perry, and answer the question that Mr. Ivan Rugambwa just made. And alongside that, I think there's a question from Peter Mwesije from ACMC. Well, there's a question to Peter, but I think that we can put you up on a coffee date with Peter so you can ask questions to him. So Perry, please, if you may respond.
Yeah, on the question on postponement is actually answered by our constitution, because Article 77(4) is very clear that to be able to postpone an election would then need to be under a state of emergency. Unfortunately, we are not under a state of emergency, and that's where the dilemma lies, because the role of postponement lies with Parliament in accordance with that article. So we find ourselves in a situation where I know the politicians are not going to postpone the elections, because we are not under a state of emergency where Parliament would have had those powers. So I don't know any other provision in the Constitution which allows for postponement apart from Uganda being under a state of emergency and an election being postponed for only 6 months. So that would be my response. But because we find ourselves in this situation, I think it's important to demand for minimum standards of holding a free and fair election in this context. And that's why the discussion on having smaller meetings, having smaller campaign rallies with the standard operating procedures in place from Ministry of Health, including washing hands, masks, and social distancing, should be one of the things that we push for. The other is the community radios. That discussion needs to happen between the citizens, pushing, but also the Electoral Commission and the Uganda Communications Commission coming to a consensus. Because if you have only 309 radio stations in this country, you will not be able to reach the millions of Ugandans. Yet if you had community radios, then you have more opportunity for candidates and for voters to be able to engage in the discussions that usually take place during elections. So for me, really, I would conclude by saying that let's push for fair rules.
Before you conclude, Perry, there's a question from Farida Nakazigwe of NTV, who is saying if you could speak a little bit about election petitions, election justice as a whole, as we prepare for the next election. Do you think that election petitions will be a serious way of resolving election disputes, or you think it's just going to be, in her own words, an advanced auction?
You see, unfortunately, the law allows for them. But I know that, for instance, the Supreme Court ruled that the period for the presidential elections, they ruled on the fact that there must be an extended period for filing, but also they gave an extension in terms of the number of days that the Electoral Commission should have to organize, another election if the need arises. So we find ourselves in a situation where our judges and our courts need to commit more to this country. I know that, for instance, at parliamentary level, there are candidates who have come to parliament because the courts were able to dispense justice. People like the Honorable Paul Mwiru, a by-election was held because he went to court and court found his petition to have merit. Where we have not seen, the courts being able to overturn an election is at the presidential level. And I think in Africa, there are only two countries, Malawi and Kenya, which have reached that level. But at lower levels, at least we have seen the courts where evidence is provided being able to, dispense justice, particularly if the evidence presented before them is compelling enough. So for me, it's a matter of continuing to push and really getting our own to commit to do the right thing. And that cannot happen if citizens sit back, because we are the ones who can be able to put the pressure on the office bearers to do the right thing. So it takes organizing, it takes mobilizing, it takes speaking out, so that at the end of the day, we're able to get, to progress in terms of our democracy. That's really what I would say to that.
Okay, thank you so much, Perry, for your insightful remarks and contribution. I'm sure people in the chat room here agree that it's been very useful. We are out of time. As you can see, we are doing this from our offices, and we have to go and beat the curfew before it's too late. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the people behind the scene who you don't see, who have put in a lot of hours to make sure that this is possible. Eshban Kwesiga, Tony, Masake, and all the staff members of Chapter 4, Uganda. And to Larry and Francis, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate. To all of you, stay safe. And as Larry said, keep hope alive. Engage, don't disengage. I think that take every opportunity to push the envelope, whether you think it's unfair or not, there will be some good coming out of it. Thank you so much, everyone, and goodbye for God and my country.